In today's video, I'll show you how I made this coffee bar. If you'd like to make this for yourself, I've got a link to plans down in the description. Let's get started.
So we'll start this video out with what might be the most difficult part of this entire build, which is to break down this big piece of either MDF or plywood, depending on whatever you got. Now the reason that I say this is difficult mainly is just because these big sheets of MDF are heavy and they're kind of awkward to hold. But regardless, the first step of this project will be to rip this panel into 3 equal pieces. And if you don't have a full-size table saw set up like this, you could always use a circular saw or a track saw. Or if you're lucky enough, there will actually be a worker at the panel saw at Lowe's or Home Depot. Good luck with that one though. Anyway, we'll put one of those pieces to the side for now to use later. But then those other 2 panels will be cross-cut to make the sides and the shelves of the main frame of this cabinet. After all the pieces have been cross-cut, that original piece of MDF or plywood should look something like this. And so for now, we'll set aside the pieces that will be used for shelves later and focus on the 4 main pieces, making up the main frame of this coffee bar. Before we can begin assembling that frame, we need to first build a base, which is just simply made from 2x4s. If you want a simple base, you can make it just like this. Or if you want a little more complex and a little stylish base, we'll end up making something like this, which will leave a gap at the bottom of the cabinet when we're finished. When assembling this base frame, there's no need to make sure everything is perfect and spotless because this entire base frame will be covered by trim and the cabinet itself. If you're thinking my 2x4s look a little sharp on the ends, that's just because I milled them down so everything would be perfectly square. This step of course is optional, but I would recommend it if you're able to do so. It just makes everything go together much nicer. If you've built this base properly, it should match the footprint profile of the bottom panel exactly, and we can just attach it with brad nails and glue. After adding probably way too many brad nails to that bottom base, we will next attach the sides similarly to how we put that bottom base on. Just a little bit of glue up against the base and with some brad nails, and if you're thinking brad nails are not strong enough to hold that in place, you can flip the cabinet on its side and then reinforce it with some screws under the frame. After the sides are secured in place, our focus will shift to putting this middle shelf in place. So we'll take that third panel that we set aside earlier and we'll cut the vertical shelf supports which that middle shelf will set upon. Now before we just go throwing those panels in place and hoping they're in the right spot, we'll first want to mark the location of where these panels are going to go on both the bottom and the middle shelf. And after we have those marked, we'll drill holes on that line, which will give us an access point for when we put nails up under the underside of the cabinet. This will all make sense in just a minute. Now you may have noticed those pieces that I put up against the side to help support that shelf. And those are just scrap trim pieces that are cut the exact same length of these vertical panels that will help hold that shelf in place for when we attach it. Now if you find yourself short a few clamps or you don't have clamps long enough, you can just build the cabinet on its side, which would essentially do the same exact thing. Anyway, now that everything is in place, we can use those pre-drilled holes from earlier to know exactly where that panel goes and secure it with brad nails up on the underside. It's easier to see on the top panel obviously, but we'll basically do the same exact thing. And one thing here is to make sure that all the pieces are in the exact spot they need to be, perfectly square and equally spaced. Otherwise, all the measurements seen in the plans will be slightly off, which obviously isn't the goal of this build. Once again, we'll just use brad nails to secure the side pieces to that middle panel, and don't worry about all the brad nail holes, we'll address that later on in the video. So as you see me taking this next measurement and begin to make the cut for these interior shelves, you might really find yourself wishing that you had the dimensions of each of these pieces that I cut so that you could pre-cut them all yourself before you get started. Now if that is the case, here is a quick preview of the plans that I do have available for this cabinet. Now obviously all of the dimensions will be revealed in the actual set of plans, but this set of plans will serve as a guideline including screenshots of everything that you have already and will see in this video to guide you along and let you build this for yourself. In my opinion, these screenshots are much easier to follow than some cartoonish image of the piece I'm trying to build. But anyway, these plans are available now for purchase with the link in the description. And now that we've seen a quick preview, let's get back to the video. Now I understand that not everything goes perfectly, so if you find yourself cutting a panel just slightly too short like I did here, you have two options. The first is just to attach some shelf pieces like I did in that shot, or you can cut the other panels maybe a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch too long, which will just slightly flex those vertical shelves and wedge that other piece into place. Once again, we'll use some scrap spacer blocks to put that shelf at the right height, and it's important to put that center shelf in place first, because once those outside shelves are in place, there would be no way to access the center shelf. This method, however, creates one small problem, and that's that we only have one part of the outer shelves attached. So we'll switch over to shorter brad nails to avoid spring out, and then from the inside, we'll just toenail through the vertical support right into that outside shelf. The only other piece of the actual frame of the cabinet we'll need to attach are these top supports. Now if you have the plans, you already have this dimension, so you won't need to make that cut. But before we can put those in place, we need to attach a back stretcher support. And I'll be using some rough sawn poplar to make this board, which I milled up to the same exact dimension as 3/4 inch trim or poplar board, or you could use pine board that you could get from the store, so no need to worry about milling up your own. The problem with this back support brace is that it shifts those top panels forward. So we'll take a crosscut section of that piece that we have, and we'll mark that to cut a little notch out, which will let those top panels set right in place, but also serve as an anchor point for that top support brace, which will give the cabinet a little bit extra strength. A crosscut sled is a fantastic tool for sneaking right up on the line, but if you don't have a crosscut sled, there's about 100 different ways you can make this cut. A miter saw, circular saw, bandsaw, jigsaw, just to name a few. So obviously do whatever works best for you. Once again, we'll mark the location of those panels, and we'll use the drill trick to mark so we can access it from the underside. Then we'll just attach that back stretcher in place with a little bit of glue and brad nails on the outside. And then in this shot, you can see that notch fits right up underneath that back support brace. With a few more brad nails, those top panels will be in their final resting place. And just a tip, if you're having trouble accessing this from the underside, flip the cabinet over on its side, or maybe turn it upside down. Whatever's easiest for you or makes this build go more smoothly. At this point in the build, the frame of the cabinet is actually finished up. Now we just need to work on the face frames and the bottom frame. And this angled cut on the bottom piece is completely optional, but this cut is made to expose a small gap on the front end of the cabinet, making it a little more stylish like I mentioned earlier. Now to be honest with you, this is a bit of a sketchy cut and I probably wouldn't recommend doing it this way. And a bandsaw or a jigsaw would be a much better option than this method. But if you do this method, make sure that you have sufficient down pressure, and under no circumstances should you ever pull the workpiece towards you. You always want to push into the blade. Otherwise you have a huge kickback risk. So whether you complete or just skip out altogether on that last step, referring to that bottom gap, we'll next need to attach these trim pieces, which once again are attached to the MDF frame just using glue and brad nails. Rather than try to construct the face frame and then attach it to the cabinet afterwards, it'll be much simpler just to put all the pieces on one at a time. Now if you're wondering why I'm using poplar, the main reason is because poplar has a closed grain pattern, meaning that it has an excellent surface for paint. If you're however looking for a more cost-friendly alternative, Pine, Douglas fir, or any other species that you have access to would be just fine. So I like to put the horizontal face frames in place first, which will sit flush with the top of each of the MDF panels. And then I'll go back and put the vertical trim pieces in, which I like to cut one at a time personally, but if you have all the dimensions and everything lined up, you could pre-cut all the pieces, which should work just fine. While brad nails work great for assembly, they definitely leave some holes in the frame. And I like to cover these up by using this Dap Dry Deck Spackling. Although any type of wood filler or anything similar that you have would work perfectly. I've just had good luck in the past with this Dap. You can get a whole jar for about $10 and that whole jar will last you a long time. So not only is it great for covering up the brad nail holes, but also any small gaps you might have in the trim or on the sides or really anywhere else on the frame. In probably half an hour or so, all of that pink putty will turn to a white dry paste, and that can be sanded off very easily. In fact, I think I jumped straight to either 180 or 220, and it almost takes no effort whatsoever to sand everything down. An optional next step is a step that will drastically improve the appearance of the cabinet, and that's to grab a small roundover bit and just soften up the edge profile of all the sharp trim pieces. If you're following along at this point, your cabinet should look something like this, and as far as the construction, we're actually finished with this cabinet. And since we're finished with the construction, we can move on to paint. So starting out, I first did a couple coats of primer with a brush and roller, and then I remembered how much I hate painting by hand, so I switched over to my paint sprayer for the final finish. I'm using Gloss Enamel Rust-Oleum white paint. If you do have a paint sprayer, this will go quite a bit quicker, but if not, the old paintbrush and roller will do just fine. At this point, we can turn our attention to the decorative top of this bar, which I'm making from hardwood. This is just some white oak that I already had. You can use any species, and in fact, you don't even have to use hardwood. Pine 2x4s or 1x4s or 1x6s would work perfectly fine if you're trying to be more budget friendly with your build. If you are, however, using any type of rough sawn or hardwood lumber, I'd first recommend milling everything down with the joiner and the planer, just to make sure that all of those individual boards are nice and flat. So I let the glue set in the clamps for probably 4 or 5 hours, and once that glue has finally set up, I'll cross cut this piece to the final dimensions, and then I'll also run it through the planer to smooth out any misaligned seams. Now if you don't have a cross cut sled, you can obviously just cut all the boards to the final length before you glue them up, and if you don't have a wider planer, you could do the same exact thing just by trying to get a better glue seam or sanding out any unevenness you have across the panel. To give this top more of a finished appearance, I'll hit all of the edges with a 1/4 inch roundover bit, and then I sanded everything down to 150 before applying stain. And speaking of the stain, I'm using Minwax Dark Walnut, although you definitely could use any stain or color that you wanted. The recipient of this bar asked for sliding doors across the front, so I originally ordered this kit just from Amazon with the intention of using it. When I opened this package up, however, I noticed that the rail was about 5 inches too long and wouldn't fit in the cabinet. I originally just planned on cutting it, but it's made of steel, and I don't have a blade to cut steel with. So a quick fix was just to grab a 1/8 inch aluminum flat from Lowe's and cross cut it to the proper length. I'll admit that I certainly could have planned this better had I researched ahead of time, but it wasn't anything that a little spray paint couldn't fix. While that paint on the aluminum bar is drying, we can get started on the doors for this cabinet. I'll be using these shaker style rail and style router bits, which will be used to cut the grooves and the joints on some poplar stock I have milled up. Now if you don't have a router table or these router bits, you could make a door that looks almost identical to what I'm doing just by cutting out a piece of plywood with the same footprint and then tacking some trim strips on the front of it. Now personally, this type of joinery for doors is one part of woodworking that I really just enjoy. And if you're thinking this looks complicated, once you've done this on the router table a couple times, it's actually very easy to do, and you can batch out and make repetitive cuts very quickly. Now if it didn't make sense as far as what I actually did with those two bits form an interlocking joint that will hold the outer frame together, and one of those two bits has an internal cutter that'll cut a nice 1/4 inch groove on the inside of each piece. That way we can slide a 1/4 inch piece of plywood down in that groove to make up the internal panel of the door. For a little extra detail on these doors, I added these diagonal strips, and as much as I wanted to try cutting them out on the router table with those bits, I wasn't overly confident that I'd be able to pull that off. So instead I just traced the overlap on those panels and then used the miter gauge on my table saw to slowly sneak up on those angles until they fit in place on the doors. After putting some glue on the back side of those diagonals, I tacked them in place with some pin nails. And once again, our Dap putty from earlier before will save the day with any gaps or any of those holes that were left over. After a quick detail with the router on those doors, we could get back to work on this rail now that the paint was finally dry. Obviously, we'll need to drill some holes in this rail to attach it to the cabinet. And since I already had the rail from the other kit, which ended up not working, I just used it as a center space guide to get that hole right in the middle, or as close to as possible. Before we can actually attach this rail to the cabinet, we need to put the doors and the pulleys in place first to make sure that everything's spaced out properly. So once I had the location of the rail where the top of the pulley would be flush with the top of the cabinet frame, I just marked the center location of each one of those holes we drilled. For this step, you will want to get those holes drilled as close as possible to the center of that hole location, so using a brad point drill bit will definitely be helpful. These spacer brackets will sit between the rail itself and the frame of the cabinet. That way when we put those doors on, they'll sit outward from the main frame of the cabinet. After attaching the rubber stoppers on the end of the rail, we can put those pulleys in place similarly to how we did on the rail, and then just drill down into the doors to secure those pulleys in place. This cabinet shell is made from MDF, meaning that there will be no wood expansion or contraction anywhere in the MDF. However, the top is made from hardwood, so there will be expansion across the grain. Before we attach that top in place, we will seal the surface with a few coats of polyacrylic, and then after it's dry, we can use these expansion brackets up inside the frame to attach the tabletop in a manner that will allow for wood movement. These doors slide very easily across the rail, but if you look down at the bottom, they swing back and forth a little bit. The easy solution here are these brackets that can be mounted to the bottom plate, which come in that hardware kit from earlier. After a quick adjustment, these bottom guide brackets will keep those doors from swinging outward. The only thing left we have to do on this coffee bar is attach a back panel, which is just a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood painted to match everything else. We will pin nail this in place, and because of that, it's easier to make a few marks to figure out where those MDF pieces are on the inside of the cabinet. With those final pin nails in place, we have a completed coffee bar. Here are a few final pictures of the end result, and if you made it this far in the video, I would love to hear your opinion on this project. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out those plans if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next video.